All right, so some of the stuff we'll cover tonight is what we've started to look at in your notes for lesson 3. But we're going to go back and do a little bit of review, some new things I'll add, and that for the most part everything will be in your notes. There are a few things that I've added. But if you have this out, we're going to take a look at it from different angles and just get a sense of the regular verb. And like I say, if we can get the regular verb down, then we get to me verbs and all that kind of stuff. Things will seem complex, but they'll be less so once we get there. But if we can get the regular verb down, then we'll be pretty well ahead in our understanding of Greek verbs and so on. So we will focus on, hey brother, we'll focus on the endings. And tonight what I want to do is spend time just making the verb. Okay, so that's where we're heading in that, but I want to go back and talk about function a little bit. So originally this is where Greek started. It started with the aorist and then built out from that. And so basically we have our aorist, and these are our roots, simplest form possible, and then out from these then the language developed and grew. And the omega system came later. The me was first, but we spend more time with omega and start there first because actually it's that particular conjugation that we find in the Greek text more often than the me verbs. But it all started with the me. So if we take the, we lengthen the vowel from epsilon to eta. We put our ending on it. This is the personal, the subject, the doer of the action, me, I, and I place, and then we have the reduplication on the front. And because they didn't like aspirates back to back like that, then they just deaspirated the theta. Same thing when we look at this then, if we take that stem out of the root and we can add then prepositions on the front of it and we just lengthen it and go. But again, you're going to find these basic roots all over the place, and we'll see so many different words as you go through the text that are built off of this. Sta, same thing, lengthen the vowel to eta, which is a lengthened form of alpha, and then we put our me ending on there because they didn't like s's. They started to drop off, and when they did that in the front, it went from systeme to histeme, and of course, and the aspiration tells me the sigma was there.
Can you remind me why it lengthens, why the alpha?
So when they join, so we'll look at this a little bit tonight, because whenever they join, the doer of the action, attach it to the root, then there's going to be, in this case was the lengthening of the vowel so that they could attach this to the stem. Caused a change in that. What we'll find is that the omega, when we add those endings on that you have at the bottom of your chart there, we'll look at it, there will be a connecting vowel. So there'll be an omicron, epsilon, that will be the connecting vowel between the stem, the root, and then the suffix at the end.
So
but originally...
So really it's sigma, tau, alpha, epsilon?
Yes.
Alpha and epsilon both turn into an
Yeah. Yeah. So before, this is how they did it, was just lengthening that vowel. This S, put the me on there, right? Don't like liquids and sigma, so the sigma drops out, and then it becomes compensatory lengthening, and we get ame. And we'll look at ame a little bit more tonight as we look at forming the verbs. We'll walk through that a little bit.
What happens to the connecting vowel this one?
So this one, because this is a long, it doesn't need anything, right? Because all the other ones would go from a short to a long. But in this case, because the sigma dropped out, it's lengthened, it doesn't. So we'll also find that like with, when we get to the aorist, because the aorist will have an augment on the front, epsilon, but if it begins with a vowel and not a consonant, if it begins with a vowel, if the vowel is long, then there are times where it just won't take the epsilon, it'll just, the vowel will stand by itself. So essentially, basically, if there's a long vowel, there's not going to be any more change than that, right? Because it can't be lengthened any further than that. So we're going to review some about function, and then we'll look at form and putting the endings together And so all this is just looking at present active indicative, and then I'll show you how to do the future, and it's basically the same as the present active. It's just a sigma added onto it. So we talk about present active indicative. Present is the tense, active is the voice, and indicative is the mood. And so when you're parsing a verb, this is what you're looking for. You're going to look for tense, voice, mood. Okay? And so anytime if you start reading like critical commentaries and they're talking about it, they say it's, present active indicative, then talking about tense, voice, and then the mood. So if you have your chart, we're going to keep coming back and looking at this. I wanted to walk through it and look at it from different perspectives and give you a sense of what's here. Basically, above the line, we're just looking at the indicative. So everything is above that line. Below the line is potentiality. Above the line is reality. And reality is always going to be in the indicative. And we'll look a little bit at subjunctive, infinitive, and participle, and some things that I want to show you, because you'll notice just by observation, looking at the chart so you can sort of get a visual perspective, you can see various tenses that make up the indicative, but then when you drop below the line, not every single tense has a subjunctive form, has an imperative form, has an infinitive form, or a participial form, right? So we'll walk through and talk about that, and I'll lay some things out for you. So tense, this is the character of an action. It can be defined either of 3 points of view. We have action occurring, action continuous, action completed. And the first one is where everything started. That's the aorist, action occurring. It's just a statement of fact. Oftentimes it'll focus on past, but it isn't limited to past. The aorist can be used as something in the future. So Mary in her Magnificat and Luke, she uses aorist tense, but she's looking to the future. And the reason why she puts it in the aorist tense, or it's communicated that way, is that it is like in the Hebrew we call a prophetic perfect. It's so certain it's going to happen, because she's talking about what God's going to do. He's going to exalt and bring down and so on. It's so certain it's going to happen that it'll be spoken of as already being done. Same thing with Romans 8, right? When that Paul links together that eternal chain of, right, predestined and so on, and then he ends with glorified. It's past, glorified, but it's looking to the future, but because it's so certain it's going to happen, that he can speak of it as already having occurred. And the aorist, the statement of fact, can be a single act, right? Blink. Or it can be used to sum up a work that took a long period of time, but it's just a statement of fact that this happened, but it can encapsulate that it took this whole entire period. So when we have in John chapter 2, when Jesus is talking about destroying the temple, right, and in 3 days I'll raise it up, and they said it took 46 years, right, for us to build the temple, and there they used the aorist tense. So it took a long period of time. Instead of using imperfect to show continuous action in the past, it just used the aorist statement of fact. It was built, but understanding encapsulated that whole process and everything that took place. So you'll find that as we start going on, when we deal with aorist and present and all that, there are different ways in which they can be used. But this is just simply breaking down to kind of action. And we start here and then work out from here. But there's different ways in which the aorist can be used. There's different ways in which present tense can be used, and so on. And so it started with the action occurring, statement of fact, action continuous, ongoing, and then action complete as a combination of the first two. So originally there were 2 types, verb types, denoting the kind of action. There was durative or linear action, and then momentary or punctiliar action. And I'll keep throwing out some various words that are used just so you know, because people use the different ones, but they're also here. I'll give you a new one, durative. But here the 2 verb types indicating durative or linear action, or the momentary or punctiliar action, and originally they used different forms to express this. So you have harao, which is see, and it can show ongoing action, and then you have adon, saw, punctiliar action. And if you look them up in your dictionary, you'll find both forms as separate words. But in reality, adon is just the aorist of harao. So that is originally how they would express that, to use the two different kinds. And then as things developed and they started using the forms to suggest that, and just instead of separate words, now we have suffixes that will indicate that. And then the combination of two ideas, punctiliar and linear. So we have action occurring, aorist. Aoristos is undefined. This is the name of the word. And then we have action continuous. This is the imperfect, right? And I told you before, probably it would be better, preferably, to refer to imperfect present, imperfect past, imperfect future. But we're not going to go and change that, because we'd have to change a whole bunch of grammars at the same time. But just so you get that sense of it. Hebrew, it's interesting because Hebrew, you only have two forms. You have the yiktol and the kal. So you have completed action, and then you have continuous action. So basically in Hebrew, they only have imperfect and perfect. But there's different ways in which those two can be utilized. Here we have a little bit more refining, and we have more flexibility in way to express things. And then we have completed action, and that is the perfect. If we want to visualize it, punctiliar is just a dot, right? Statement of fact. Again, it can take a whole series of actions that were involved in this one thing and state it as a fact, and use the aorist to do that. And so just when you come across these things, stop and ask yourself sometimes why this tense is used instead of that tense, right? Why aorist instead of imperfect? Like in the reference to John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, right? Why not use aorist, right? Was before, right? And then everything came into existence, because we know that's what he's talking about when he goes to verse 3 and talks about everything was created, right, through him. But instead he uses the imperfect, because he wants to show continuous existence before everything was created. So when you come across these things, just stop and ask yourself, why this as opposed to that? And the other reason why is John is going to do a contrast between was and then statement of fact, aorist, became flesh, right? And that kind of thing. So he's going to set up a contrast within the context itself. So we have protracted action. This is linear durative, so there's another word for you. And this is basically just a straight line, but it also can be seen this way as continuous or repeated or frequentative. In other words, it's a series of actions, not necessarily saying I do this every single right moment. When you think about, pray without ceasing, might be more like this idea, right, of a habitual praying throughout your day. Not necessarily every second of your day are you caught in prayer, right? But it's something that you do regularly throughout the day. And sometimes being able to visualize it this way is helpful. Sort of get your mind wrapped around what is the thing that's being explained. Then you have the perfective. So you have action that occurs with abiding results, or an action that builds to its culmination and then finally is completed. But truly in a true perfect, it is both of these. It is this. It is an action that takes place, or a process that comes to a point of completion, and then the abiding results continue on. And that's sort of the basic root of a perfect, but then there can be varying degrees. Where's the focus? Is it on the abiding results after? Is it on the action leading up to the completion of, right? So Paul will do this in 2 Timothy when he talks about I fought the good fight, right? And so on, finished course. He uses perfect tense. So I've done this, and where he stands now at the end of his life, he knows he's going to die, right? As he looks back, he sees he has done this, and now here he is in the end. So always then, too, when you think about these things, think about, okay, the writer, where he is as he's writing this, and what is he looking at, right? Like I say, with Paul, as he sits at the end of his life and ministry, as he looks back, he sees this process coming to a completion. So just start trying to think of it in relation of, as I'm put myself in his shoes kind of thing, right? And see it from their perspective. Then there are 6 tenses in the indicative mood. So if you look at your chart, essentially you have 6. You have the present, you have the imperfect, you have the future, you have the aorist, you have the perfect and the pluperfect. There's future perfect and so on, but it existed in the language, but we don't find it in the New Testament. So these things I've left out. So essentially there are 7, but you're not going to run across it, so why learn it? Same thing with optative. So when we drop below the line, there was optative in use like the subjunctive. Subjunctive is like this may happen. Optative is even more remote than the subjunctive, but you don't run across it, so it's really not that common, so we just leave it undealt with. So the 6 tenses in the indicative mood are the present, the imperfect, the future, the aorist, the perfect, and then the pluperfect. There are 2 tenses then in the subjunctive and the imperative. So if you look at your chart then, the 2 are the present, which we see that in the subjunctive, and we'll come back to this in a minute too, because we'll also see that when we talk about connecting vowels, connecting vowel can also tell you whether it's in the indicative or whether it's subjunctive mood. So it's not merely just something that connects the suffix to the stem, but it also helps us in parsing and figuring out, is this indicative or is this subjunctive? Is it reality or is it down in the potentiality kind of thing? And then the other is the aorist, and we find that the aorist is only found in subjunctive and the imperative. And the imperative is going to be really easy because actually if you look at your chart, look at the imperative. Right? Lueto, luete, lueto, lueto san. So these are built off of, right? Well, we find above the line. So by the time we get to imperative, knowing the imperative will be really easy. And we'll build that as we go along. So basically, then we have the present, the aorist, and then there are 3 tenses in the infinitive and the participle. So if we drop below the line, we have the present, which has the infinitive form. And so in English, the way we know an infinitive is that we have the word to before it, to, right? That's how we know in English if it's an infinitive. Well, with the infinitive in Greek, there's also this similar kind of thing. So if you see a to, right, to before a statement, right, then we can often know there is an infinitive behind it in the Greek. And then whenever you see ain like that, you'll know that's infinitive. Ain, sai, estai. And you'll figure out those endings. But essentially when you see ain, you'll just know infinitive. So that will get in your head. And then we have the participle. So essentially the 2 are the present and then the aorist. Also they both have infinitive and then participles. And then we have the perfect. And you'll notice that the perfect will have the reduplication. Has it in the indicative, also has it in participle. So once you learn that key to unlock that door, right, wherever you see that reduplication like that, it's pretty much going to tell you got a perfect. Unless you're dealing with didomy, but you'll know the difference. You'll know the difference. The other way was that you'll look at the endings. And then, so present, aorist, perfect. Then tenses of the indicative are commonly divided into 2 classes. We talked about this before. There's the primary, or called the principal tenses. This is present, future, and perfect. And the reason why they're called this is simply because they don't have an augment on the front of them, because secondary tenses are referred to as historical. They all have the augment. They have the epsilon, which was an adverb, and then it was attached to the front of the word, and that's how it became used the way that it does. And that's the imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect. So if you look on your chart, all of those will have that augment on the front, the epsilon. So we got into voice a little bit, I think, last time. So voice, in Greek, you have both voice and tense. They both deal with the action of the verb, but from 2 varying perspectives. When tense looks at kind of action, voice, on the other hand, relates the action in regards to the subject of the action, and therefore you have the personal endings on there. There is only 3 voices in Greek: active, middle, and passive. Originally there were only 2, but then it developed into a third one, and that's the passive. And that's why the middle and the passive share the same endings. So when you look at your chart, you'll find, right, you'll have M and P, and you'll see that M and P, you have the same form for both of them. Context will be the deciding factor as to which is which. And sometimes you'll have a middle and a passive right next to each other. But again, the context will tell you which one it is. So, basic understanding of voice then: active voice, subject is acting, he is loosing. Middle voice, subject is participating in the results of the action, he is loosing himself, or the subject is acting in reference to himself. So here's the thing. So when he talks about, Paul does in Ephesians chapter 1 verse 4, that we were chosen in him before the foundation of the world, middle voice, God did this for himself. So he chose you, he chose me before the creation of the world, he chose us for himself. And then we have passive voice. A lot of times we'll get these great theological statements in regards to our salvation will be in the passive. The subject is being acted upon, or he is being loosed. So that's the simple of it, but again, the amazingness of the understanding, right, will come as you get into context in that, but always start with the basics and then work out from that. The parent language likely had 2 voices, active and middle. The middle forms then came to be used to express the passive idea. And the passive voice has the same forms as the middle in almost all tenses except for aorist and future. They will take the theta eta. Okay? So if you look at your chart here, you'll notice for the aorist passive, future passive, both of them have theta eta. You have with the aorist, you have the augment on the front, so that also helps you understand which is which. And with the future, we'll talk about this tonight, but the sigma is that tense stem that we'll talk about. It's that element that attaches, it's that key that unlocks the door, and you'll find the sigma on there. And the thing that's interesting, I'll just tell you this, but you won't know it now, but just hear me and believe me later. But what's interesting is that the theta eta will be passive, but all these here, san, te, men, sigma, and nu, all of those are active endings. Okay? So with the aorist, to form an aorist passive, you'll have the theta eta, but you'll also have active endings that are attached to it. So you have 2 things you're going to have to deal with there. This just tells you it's passive. This tells you it's whether it's first, second, third, singular, plural, he, she, it, right? They, that kind of thing. So that, the ending will unfold that. The theta eta will just tell you it's passive. It's happening to them instead of them doing it. So
both the aorist passive and the future passive, they both have the theta eta and the sigma. The sigma is the sign of the future, but how you know the aorist isn't the future is because it has that augment.
yeah. And so basically, if we're talking about anything that's going to be, for the most part, looking to the past, right, we have the epsilon. And that's really the only difference that determines between primary and secondary. It's just that augment on the front, and that's it. So when we look at, all right, this is cool. So all these, this is 1 Corinthians 4 when Paul's praying, right? We continuously give thanks to God, my God, right? Always concerning you, for the grace of God, which, so notice the te here. It looks all the way back to the grace. See how they share the same article? So this right here, this, it's actually an aorist participle. It's what we refer to as an articular participle, but it is defining, if you will, the grace. So we have the same case, right? So just like Paulos, apostolos, doulos, right? Because they're defining him, they share the same. Well, same thing with here. So this helps us connect it back to the grace, and he further elaborates the grace. The grace which he gave to us. Now, this, if I see thais, remember, epsilon iota, something happened here. So this is one of the little ditties we'll learn. If I see thais, I think thence. If I see ace, I think ents. Because essentially, this was thence. Right? So this used to have a new tau here. And the sigma and the tau, they assimilate. Right? So we end up losing the tau, but we don't lose it, right? It assimilates to the sigma because it's the same point of articulation. Well, then we have the nu and the sigma. Well, liquids and sigmas don't go together, so the nu drops out, compensatory lengthening. So all of these here, these are all, and all of them are long, right? So we have eta, eta, eta here. Because of loss, we have this lengthened, it won't become an eta because it's already long, epsilon iota. And these then all look back to what God did, right? He gave, he enriched, he confirmed, he called. And so the assurance is then he will confirm us in the future. This is future. He will do this, right? He had done this, same word right here, right? Reduplication. So this goes back to the original. Remember, dido me? So this is a built off of a me verb. And that's why we have the reduplication of the first syllable is here. So it's not perfect. This is just reduplication off the old system, off me verbs. And then we put the augment on the front and theta eta, and this is aorist passive. And then this is looking to the future, and he will confirm. And then, because he confirmed and he will confirm, Paul says, pistos, faithful, ha theos, God is, who also called us. So all those theta etas tell me everything that God did, right? And so all of this then is the substantiation of the statement he makes in verse 2, to the church of God. Right? So that's his statement. It's God's church. And then these passives substantiate why he says that. Because he did this and this and this and this and this. So then if you're going to preach on that passage, that's the starting of your outline. Yeah.
So with the participle, that aorist doesn't have the augment.
Yeah, because this isn't looking at above the line. It's not indicative. It's below the line. So therefore, it won't take the augment. But because it's used with these indicatives, statement of fact, it carries the same force. So we'll find with the participle there's flexibility, but it takes its cue from whatever finite verb it's connected with. Finite verb is basically whatever's in the indicative. If it's an imperative, the participle will be connected to imperative, it becomes imperatival. If it's with indicatives, then it takes the indicative force and it's a statement of fact like the others.
What's the definition of a participle?
It's ing words, pretty much, yeah, in English. And there's reasons why he uses a participle there first, but I'm not going to get into that. But it's really cool, but it has its reasonings. So mood, I don't know if we got into mood too much, but mood just basically deals with the relation of action to reality. So questions asked, is the action conceived as really taking place, or is it potential? Well, mood answers these questions, right? If it's in the indicative, it's subjunctive, and so on. And again, when you have letters like Romans, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, most often these statements, theological statements, are put in the indicative, and then comes the imperatives. They flow out of the indicative. So I don't know if this is in your notes, but this is basically the simplest definition. So if you want to memorize the definition for these, the simplest way. Tense deals with kind of action. Voice deals with subject in relation to action. And then mood deals with the reality of action. So tense, kind of action, is it occurring, continuous, completed? Voice, subject in relation to the action, active, middle, or passive? And then mood, the reality of the action. Is it a statement of fact or an affirmation of the fact? So tense endings. Now, I want to spend the rest of our time, we'll just be looking at the form, and we'll make some verbs. We're going to use the regular verb lu because it's the simplest, and then work out from that. But there are the types of tenses. So we have primary tenses. These are the unaugmented without the epsilon. Present, future, and then perfect. And then we have, if this is our chart up here, so this is the present active. This is future active, and then this is perfect active. And all of these, like I say, in the indicative, they're all without the augment on the front, okay? But I'll just tell you, the present tense, though, can be used of something in the past. We call it a historical present. And the author will use that to make, in other words, usually when we find that is in the Gospels. Because the writer of the gospel wants to draw us into the event and have us sort of in there, right? And sort of experience what's going on. And so oftentimes we'll have what we call a historical present used, so you can sort of get yourself in the position of, I'm a spectator and this is what's going on. They use it to draw you into the episode that they're explaining and talking about. John will use it quite often, more often than most. And usually in the NASB, I don't know if NIV or King James does this, but you'll see the little asterisk, and usually that indicates that there's a historical present being used there. And sometimes they'll translate it past tense, which is really unfortunate because it's missing the point of, and
I think King James is past tense because when I got an ASB and I saw that for the first time.
oh, okay.
Why the same?
Yeah. So usually with those, it's like it's telling you it's a historical present, and so it's to sort of draw you in. Mark is really good at that. So kind of like in Mark's gospel, he's sort of like, so I like reading Westerns, and Louis L'Amour is one of the authors I like to read. And I like his short stories. He has a way of just, the first few lines, he just draws you right into the story. You're in it, right? And then he just shoots you out at the end. Mark does the same way. The way that he writes it in Greek is he just pulls you into this episode, which is part of the reason why it's argued that he's likely writing as from Peter's perspective, because it's such a first person on the scene. The way he describes it is someone who was actually there, and Peter likely is the one who gave him all of this information, sat down and told him. And so he's getting it from a first-hand witness of everything. And so Mark writes it from that perspective. So he draws you in, like you're there, you're seeing this action going on, and he gets you to experience it, and then he spits you out and on to the next one, right? So most of the time we'll find those historical presents in the Gospels. And again, it's just the use of the author. So just because it doesn't have an augment doesn't mean it can't be used for something in the past. Same with the perfect tense, right? It can be used as something in the past, and so on. And then we have secondary tenses. These are with the augment, imperfect tense, aorist tense, and then pluperfect. And again, all of these then have the augment on the front of them. This is the epsilon. Pluperfect, same thing. So pluperfect, we have the reduplication, like the perfect. So that tells us it's perfect. And then the augment on front of the reduplication, then we know it's the pluperfect and not the perfect. So again, if once you learn these little keys to look for, then this is what you're going to look for when you start parsing. What we call parsing verbs and pulling it apart is just looking for these little keys that unlock the meaning and significance of the words that are used there. And it won't take you very long to figure these things out, right? But this is just to help you. I realize over time it's sometimes helpful to visualize, get a sort of mental picture of what it looks like. So hence the chart. So forming the Greek verb, then, there are several things that are involved in this, and we didn't get into this last time, but it's in your notes. So we have the verb stem. This is the simple form of the verb, constitutes the foundation of its inflection. It is inaccurate then to refer to this part of the verb as the root, okay? So there is a difference. Most words that you look up in your dictionary will be what we call the stem, okay? So most of the time, if you look this up in your dictionary, unless it's one that has roots in bracket, which the fifth revised UBS text actually has that. They have some of the roots and so on, but this is basically then your stem, lambano. And this is what you'll look up in your dictionary. But the root of it is lab. So most lexicons will have this, what we call stem, but then this is the root. This is going back to its simplest form. So we're just going to talk about how do we build a word from the stem, since most of the time that's what you're going to encounter, but you'll learn the roots as we go along. The tense stem, then, this is the form of the verb employed to distinguish the tense. So we have sigma for future tense and then sigma alpha for aorist tense. So if you look on your chart, you'll see that for the aorist, you'll see sigma alpha. And you have that for the aorist active and also aorist middle and passive, right? So whether it's the active, middle, or passive, we have sigma alpha and then we have the augment on the front. For the future, we just have sigma and no augment. So I may not spend a lot of time with you doing this with the future, but I'll just show you with the present because essentially the future is just built off the present. So this is present active indicative. Luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusi. Okay? All I have to do is if I want to make it future is that I'm going to put a sigma between my suffix and, in this case, the root, or if it's longer than the stem, right? But I'm going to put it between there. So if I put a sigma here, luso, it is I loose to I will loose. And the only difference is that sigma, okay? Luces, you will loose. Luce, he, she, it will loose. Lusamen, we will loose. Lucete, you will loose. And then lususi, they will loose. So the difference between the present and the future active indicative is just that sigma, and that's it.
I've noticed on a couple of these, they, like on that last one,
Yes.
here it has a new in parentheses. What does that mean?
It's called a movable new.
Okay.
And so usually, there's no hard and fast rule for why it's put on there, but I'll give you what I think is the reason, okay? Usually when you find a new at the end of something like that is when it precedes a word that begins with a vowel. Because you remember originally when the Greek text was written, the original, they didn't put spacing between the words. So the only way to tell how a word ended and how a word began, right, was by the case endings and verb endings and all of that, right? And so therefore, if you have this then is going to precede a word that begins with a vowel, then they would put the movable new in between that, and then they would make a distinction between this word and this word. That's why I think that they do it, and I'm pretty sure that's why. No, no. Yeah, it's just to separate the words, right? So then when we look at it from our perspective, now the words are spaced, right? In the Greek texts that we have, we have accent marking on there. They didn't do that. They knew the accents. And essentially, originally in Greek, every syllable was accented. So like Italian and French, they're melodic. It's like you're sort of singing the language if you speak it correctly, right? So every syllable is accented. There's a rising and a lowering, right? Acute, grave. Circumflex is if your voice rises and lowers on the same syllable, and that's where it came from. So originally, originally they didn't have the accent marks, and the words were connected, no spacing. Now we have the spacing and we have the accent marks, and so we have to look at it from that perspective. And unfortunately, when you just look at it as just isolated in the Koine period and that's it, then it doesn't make any sense, right? So some grammars will say, we don't know why they put the new there. It's a pretty safe bet. It's because in cases where I found it reading through, you'll find this, that it's with a word that, right, is coming before one that begins with a vowel. Yep. So the connecting vowel then, this is used for uniting the suffixes with the stems or the tense stems. So you'll have the word stem or the root. You'll have the tense stem, whatever it is, like sigma, sigma alpha, and then you'll have connecting vowel, and then you'll have, right? So you'll notice, so look at the aorist active. You have sigma alpha. Well, it doesn't need a connecting vowel because it already has the alpha. So the alpha functions like that. And then you just place the endings on there. So if you look at first person plural, aorist active, right? Saw men. So you have the sigma, the alpha, and then you have the men ending, right? So that doesn't need a connecting vowel because it has the alpha. Essentially, that's what the alpha is. But with the future, because it's just the sigma, it will have then that connecting vowel, epsilon or omicron. So this will also tell you and help you distinguish, can help you distinguish the moods by the connecting vowel, okay? So if we go here, so we have present active indicative, right? So it's omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else, okay? So originally luo was lu-a mi, because there was a mi ending, okay? So the mi drops off because it's the mi conjugation, and that started phasing out, and the omega was coming in. So we drop the mi off the ending, the omicron, the connecting vowel, gets lengthened to an omega, and that's where we get luo from. Okay? Then we have ace, a, amen, right? Omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else. So we have ete, a, ace, and then this, usi, was antsi. So omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else. And then all the changes with the present active indicative, this here, compensatory lengthening. This here, compensatory lengthening, right? So we know that something happened there to change that. And then if you drop then down below the line, subjunctive, then notice we have long omega. Well, it's not going to change because it's already long. Can't go any longer than that, right? But then we have the eta is the long of epsilon. So subjunctive we can tell by the long connecting vowel. So you'll look at the ending and it'll look similar to the indicative, right? But then when I look at the connecting vowel and it's long like this, then I'm thinking subjunctive. So even the connecting vowel can help you distinguish between whether it's the indicative mood or the subjunctive mood. So across the board then, we can see the same thing. Present, middle, or passive, same thing. Here's my middle and passive endings, but here's the lengthened vowel, right? Eta, omega, all the way down. That's the imperative. Then we jump over here. This is our aorist. Because it drops below the line, it's not in the indicative anymore, we lose the augment. But we still have then lengthened vowel. And so this will be the indicator. Subjunctive usually has an eta or an omega as the connecting vowel. So if we come here, same thing. This is our aorist, middle, and passive. Here's our middle and passive endings. Here's my sigma. But then I have the lengthened vowel all the way down here. So that tells me subjunctive. Aorist passive, same thing, omega eta. So all of these that have subjunctive, and it's only the present and the aorist, right, that have subjunctive, and all of them carry an eta or omega as a connecting vowel.
Why is the aorist passive? Why is the first singular? Why is it on one of it? Why is one an omega and one the aim?
Here and here?
Oh no, that top one.
Oh, up at the top here?
Lutho and elutane. But why is it ain and o at the ends? You see what I'm saying?
We dealing with the indicative or down below?
Or just I'm just looking at trying to figure out why the endings are different like that.
Between
It's
this,
lengthened.
between the subjunctive and the other?
It doesn't have the augment because it's in subjunctive. But then one is an omicron, one is an or one is an eta, and then nu.
Oh, up at the top, second.
Yes.
So this will be in its place, right? Because it just drops, this one's going to drop the nu off of it. And this is the shorter form because it drops below the line.
Okay.
Because you have nu, sigma. Nu doesn't always have to be used. So in this case, it's just going to drop when it comes down below the line. And then this becomes the lengthened form. And then we just follow the rest of the pattern down. But you'll notice with the accenting, you have the iota drops underneath. This will also tell you subjunctive, is that you have that epsilon, the eta and the iota subscript. Right? Because you have it on the present. So once you get those little keys in your mind, right? Omicron, epsilon, even connecting vowels above the line, below the line, omega, eta, iota subscript. And I'll help you distinguish between them. Sometimes we'll find it, and we'll talk about this in a little bit later, but there'll be forms that look exactly the same, right? So in this case, use example, if you look at the imperative. So this is, right, second person, luete, same thing. So which is it, indicative or imperative? Context will tell you. So every once in a while you'll have these shared forms that look exactly the same, but then you look at the context and you'll. So let's build the forms and we'll look at how to put these things together. So this is just going on the bottom of your chart. So we have the primary tense endings for active, middle, and passive. So we're just going to work with those and form our verbs. So originally was me, CT, mente, nti, which nti became nsi. So in your notes, I have that at the bottom. I should have that, right? But I just put nsi instead of nti. Basically, the tau before an iota, it became a sigma. And then liquids and sigmas don't go together, right? And so the nu is going to drop out, and that's how it becomes eventually usi. So all of these then is we have this connecting vowel that's going to go between the suffix and the root or the stem. In this case, the me ends up dropping out. Compensatory lengthening, we're going to get an omega out of that, and that becomes the omega ending, and that's where that came from. Because the middle and passive is built off of the active endings. So me CT became my sai tai. So we add our connecting vowels in all of these, and this is how we make our forms. But then we know that changes came as a result of that. But omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before anything else. I don't know if we have that.
The notes that I've written down.
Okay. I should double check, make sure.
I don't remember seeing that.
Make a mental note to put that. No, all right, that's it. It's good we figured that out, man. Gotta get that stuff down. All right, so verbal suffixes then, this is the determination proper. This serves as tense, voice, person. Number originally was me, CT, mente, nti, became nsi, which eventually then becomes usi. So if we put it together, this is where all the endings came from. It started, if you will, from the primary and then transition secondary, started with active and then became middle and passive. And we can see this, you're not going to see it, but studying the family of languages going back to the parent, we can see from Greek to Sanskrit going backwards, then to the parent tongue and so on. We can see these same endings. And so this was a part of the family and the languages that developed. And so there's a lot of similarities that cross over. And then eventually we can see how this happens. So we drop the iota and we have mu. Mu then becomes nu. Nu is what? N. It's a nasal, right? So from mu, which is a bilabial nasal, becomes a alveolar nasal, but it stays a nasal. So we can see the changes that happen all the way across. Same thing with C, then they just drop the iota. Well, this is final form, right? And then from this there's Latin. And so we can see these endings carry over into Latin, and then the tau is going to drop out, and so therefore it doesn't have it. So if we look at the parent tongue going backwards, same, we can see it carry across. So this way, I'm going to move you this way, but essentially we can work back through the various languages in the same family and see the common things that happen. So in Greek, we'll find that there are words that begin with the double consonant. They like to put a vowel before it, an epsilon before a double consonant in a word. Ecthus. Well, Spanish does the same thing. Escuela, estada. They have two consonants. They'll put an E-class vowel in the front of it. So there's a lot of these similarities in languages, right? So we can do the same thing with Hebrew. There's times where I will look at words in Aramaic and Arabic, and I can see roots in how these words related to each other, and so on. But so we can see this family connectedness that goes on. So we can look back at the parent tongue, and it would be this. We have, this is Sanskrit, Bahami, Bahasi, Bahati, and then we come to Greek. Same thing, carries those endings, Pami, Pasi, Pati, and then we have the transition between the mi stem to the omega, but then we then carry this over to Latin, and here are the endings for Latin. So Alfredo Trombetti, linguist, he believed that if we had all of the materials available to us and so on, that we could trace everything back to what was the parent tongue that was spoken at the Tower of Babel before everyone was split up, right? Which, when you think about this, okay, just looking at the Old Testament, you might sit there and wonder, okay, so you have this people group that speaks Hebrew. They come into a land of Canaan. How can they communicate with the people there? Right? Because there's so much similarity in language. So watching this war going on in Ukraine, I can hear Russian words, but there's also Ukrainian words, right? I can somewhat figure out what they're saying just because I know Russian. I pick up enough words and so on, or at least endings of forms. I know where the verb is, noun, and so on. I can somewhat construct what they're saying in the conversation as you watch the news. So what we might think is that at the Tower of Babel, everything was so radically changed that there was no relationship. No, there is a common thread to all of those things. So Trombetti believed that if we had all that stuff, we could trace all the way back to what was the original. So these are endings, okay? The me ends up dropping off, lengthen omicron to an omega. So this is going back to our first lesson, right? Our vowel chart. Short forms, long forms, so on. So we'll just keep going back to that. When we talk about the future tense, we're going to talk about amalgamation. We'll go back to lesson 1, right? When you have a sigma and a ki becomes xi, or a sigma and a p becomes psi. So you're going to look at a word and you're going to see this pso at the end. I'm going to know it's a future, not, right, a present. There's a sigma there because there was a p at the end of the stem. I added my tense stem sigma, and then I added my ending omega, and the sigma and the p combine together and make a psi. So I'm going to see a psi, but I'm going to know p sigma omega, right? So all this stuff will just keep going back to stuff we learned at the alphabet. So one of the things that happened in the Greek language is they lost the sigmas. Intervocalic sigma dropped out. So this is where we get ace. And I'll tell you why they put the sigma on the end of this one in a second. So we have luete becomes luesi. Tau before iota in the Greek language. If you trace it historically, the tau became a sigma before a final iota. Okay? And so that is what caused the change. And then you have a sigma between two vowels, and therefore it becomes lue. And the only reason why the sigma is here is to distinguish between the second person and third person. Right? You could discern that from context, okay, whether it's second person or third person, right? But then they decided, for convenience sake, they just appended a sigma on the end of it to distinguish between the two endings. So we can see then all the endings, they started from primary tenses and get carried over to secondary tenses. So you can see the movement of the language. So learn these endings, mente. So when I see mente, okay, then I'm thinking it's still, we're talking about what person here? First person plural, second person plural, third person plural. So I come over here and I have the same thing. First person plural, second person plural, third person plural. That's active, right? Or that's the primary ending. This is the secondary ending. But you can see how they just built these off of those. So that's why they're referred to as the primary tenses. That's where everything started from as far as these endings, and it expanded out from that. So it started with the me, then it moved to this, then it moved to this. The desire to communicate and be more precise resulted in more changes to the language. So then when we come to the middle or passive, also built out of the active and the primary tenses. We have me, CT. Here we have my, psi, tai. Every time I see these, I know middle or passive. Same with here. Meta, esse, ntai. Meta, esse, ntai. Difference between here and here. these don't have an augment, these will have an augment. So we just look for those little markers and those cues, and they tell us a whole lot. And it's these elements that are added to the stem or the root that bring the meaning, right? Because you have just the basic meaning of the root or the stem, but then as you start putting these endings on and so on.
What does the new slash sans mean? Like the new slash?
So there's two different options for the ending here, new or san. Yeah. And again, this was built off of this tau before a final iota became a sigma, and then liquids and sigmas don't go together. Nu drops out and it becomes ansi becomes usi. All right, so let's start with these. We'll just build them. We're going to deal with first person. So for a while, we're just going to keep doing this, building this verb, right? So we can look for these things, look for these little clues and markers that'll unpack everything. So we start with I, you, and the third person, he, she, it. First person plural, we. Second person plural, you. And third person plural, they. And so this is the subject who does the action, okay? You can also have the subject indicated apart from this. And if that's the case, then it's emphasis being placed on that. They want to clarify who the doer of the action is, right? Sometimes you'll have a reflexive, he himself did this, right? So he, if we do luo, he loosed, you can put a reflexive pronoun on there to indicate he himself did this. So there are different ways to expand on that, but essentially when you look at a verb in Greek, you have the doer and the root action indicated by one word, right? But then when you translate it, then you might have several words depending. So here's our root. We'll begin with this present active indicative. To make that, we add our endings on here, me, si, ti, our connecting vowel or variable vowel, and this just connects the suffix to the stem or the root. Omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else. The me conjugation started to drop out, so the me ending was dropped and the omicron was lengthened to an omega. So this is going to be, essentially this is what's happening behind the scenes. So if you want to make the first person singular I loose, you're going to start with that variable vowel and connect and put it on there, but then it becomes lengthened omega because the endings dropped off. As you write in language, you know this, but for us, we need to learn this. Luesi, so we have an interval calyx sigma. Sigma drops out. Because of that, we have compensatory lengthening, and we have lues, and the sigma is attached to the end for the sake of distinguishing between second and third person. But again, wherever we see epsilon iota, omicron, upsilon, we're thinking compensation or contraction. So that when I see the aorist passive, I see thence, right? I see thes, I think thence. I see ace, I think ence. At t, same thing happens. So the tau before a final iota became a sigma. And again, then you're going to have this compensatory lengthening because you have this interval calyx sigma. It's going to drop out, and therefore you have lue. And so that is our present active indicative, first, second, and third person singular. I, you, he, she, it.
Could you repeat that, the phrase you were saying when you see ace, you think?
When I see ace, I think ence. If I see epsilon iota, nu tau, right? If I see ace, I think ence. If I see thes, I think thence. So we'll learn these as we go along, little sayings. My dad had one, know your sauces and own your owns. So that's another one. I'll show you when we get to aorists why he does that. So here you have I am loosing, you are loosing, he, she, it is loosing. If we do the first, second, and third plural, we take our root, we add our ending, men, te, nsi, and then we have our connecting vowels. So omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else. So this also tells me, because I'm going to see usi, right? If I see usi, I know one, it's omicron, upsilon, so something happened, there was compensation or contraction, but I also know because it was an omicron, there's an O-class vowel, not an E-class vowel, then this had to be a mu or a nu, right? If it was something other than mu or nu, then I would know epsilon, and there would be then A instead of. So liquids and sigmas don't go together. The nu drops out, compensatory lengthening, and we have luusi. So we get the participles. You're going to have feminine participle. Usia, same thing. It was antsia, became usia. Nu tau, right? Tau sigma, assimilate. Liquids and sigmas don't go together. Nu drops out, compensatory lengthening. We have usia from antsia. So at the beginning, learning it this way, it explains a whole bunch of different things down the line, getting to participles and all that kind of thing. But for the most part, most grammars written now, beginning ones, you don't learn these kinds of things up front. So down the line, then, there are things that are going to be happening, and you're not going to understand why. But in this case, by the time you get there, get to me verbs, everything will be, you'll know it. You'll be able to pick it out for yourself. I won't even have to tell you. You'll just look at it and know. I know what happened here. So sometimes, not just memorizing the change, but knowing why it changed is so much more beneficial. So this is our present active indicative. And again, if I want to make it a future, then all I have to do is add a sigma between the ending and the stem or the root. And it goes from I loose to I will loose. So essentially, you've just learned present active indicative and future active indicative. The only difference between the two is sigma. And then if I saw sigma alpha, then I would know it's aorist. And we'll get to that. So ami, this is the verb to be. It's a stative verb. It just means to exist or to be. Oftentimes we'll have this with a participle if the author wants to intensify a state of existence. So we have what we'll call a periphrastic perfect. Paul likes to use these things. You are in the state of being sanctified. Are you in the state of being saved? And he wants us to understand that the state of existence of this is who you are, right? And essentially the reason why he does that is he wants to say this is who you are, therefore be that. So if you take a me, same thing. We add our endings on there. Me, si, ti, men, te, nsi. And all I do is add my S on the front, right? And from Metzger's book, he gives you this as one of the roots. In this case, it's a biliteral root. And we add it on to here. The sigma is going to drop out. Why? Mu, right? Liquids and sigmas don't go together. In this case, the sigmas drop out. And compensatory lengthening.
Does the first one always drop out, not the second one? So like, why doesn't the mu drop out? Is it always the first one in order?
I would say yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So rules, right? Half rules and exceptions. The general principle is yes. That's what happens. The first one will drop out. And remember, because it's the idea is they're moving to that, like Hebrews, they're moving to that syllable, right? So they're trying to expedite speech and that. And so usually what happens is you're going to have the change happen up front as opposed to the ending that comes, right? And then if we have SC, which was basically epsilon, sigma, sigma, iota, the two sigmas, they just joined together. And because there was this intervocalic sigma, right? So you had, so S is your root, but you have a sigma here and a sigma here. They assimilate just like a sigma and a tau, right? Because you're going to pronounce them together. But then you have an intervocalic sigma, so that's going to drop off, and there we have compensatory lengthening. So that will be your present indicative, and notice there's no active. So with the verb aimer, there is no voice. It's just present indicative. It's tense and mood, and that's it. It's a stative verb. So again, if you learn these as these are not true diphthongs, but again, most grammars that begin, these are diphthongs, and this is how you memorize it, right? But knowing that they weren't diphthongs in the time of Christ, they ceased to be that, and they're formed by compensation or contraction. So we'll see it here, but there's so many other places you're going to come across epsilon, iota, omicron, upsilon, and you're going to look at it and go, I know something happened here, right? And sometimes you'll get to that point, like when I first was doing Greek in seminary, and we had to do these translation projects and stuff. And so you come across something and you're thinking, well, at first glance, I don't know this word. You know, as you start building your vocabulary and that, you start knowing these things just by sight, and you can easily pick it apart. But at first, you just coming across words, and like at first you're not recognizing them right away. But then you're like, okay, well, I can pull this apart, because what word do I look up in the dictionary? I'm not going to find the full form that's in the Greek text, right? Because it all has endings and everything. So how do you find the dictionary form? Well, you've got to be able to pull it apart. Well, if you don't know the word off sight right away, right, then you can start picking these things apart. Well, I see epsilon, iota, omicron, upsilon, something happened here, right? And I can work out from that. If it's a verb, then I know if I see usi, then there was an ontsi, right? So it had to be a nu or a mu, because the connecting vowel, omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else. So these little ditties that you'll have in your head, right? At least it'll be enable you to pull things apart to get to that form that you're going to look up in your dictionary, right? And learn the word. Otherwise, you're going to have to then use all the different tools out there that'll parse it for you, and so on. And there's a place for that, but you know, ultimately you don't want to be dependent on that, because sometimes those things are wrong. Because sometimes you'll have an archaic form, or sometimes you'll have a shared form, present indicative as opposed to present imperative. Context, right? You've got to figure that out. Some of these parsing things, they're not calculating context, they're just pulling a word apart. So they might parse it system-wise as a present active indicative when actually it's an imperative. But only context will tell you that. But the system isn't thinking that way, right? So there's usefulness to them, but I tell people you should still know the language to use those tools, right? Because they're not always going to be accurate. And so essentially this is all we have. S is our root. Attach it onto these. I'm not even going to tell you how this one works out because I'll confuse you. But this is what it originally was, and this is what it is at the end, SA. So you can write it down. You see if you can figure out what happened.
What was the final form?
So this is essentially I am. So when Christ says ego eimi, I am, right? Or Paul says this in Galatians. He says, I no longer am I, ego, right? So you'll find eimi and ego next to each other. I no longer am I. So I am, you are, he, she, it is, we are, you are, and they are. So we'll spend another week looking at this. We'll just be looking at forms now. Function, as you go along, you'll learn more about the function, right? But just get the basics down. Kind of action, 3 voices, right? The issue of mood, it's either indicative or it's, right, subjunctive, imperative, optative. So it's either indicative, reality, or potentiality. So start with that, and then we'll start working out from the significance of all these other things. But once you get into imperatives, then we'll talk about if you have an imperative. So with Paul's case, he likes to use these statements of stop doing something, right? So present tense is you're doing this, because present tense is continuous action. And in that case, it shows time. You're doing this, knock it off. Or don't go down this way, then he'll use an aorist imperative plus a negative. So we'll get all into all those dynamics, but just up front, just get reality, potentiality, and then all the other shades of meaning will come. But we'll keep looking at the form.